Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka it's the biggest tournament weekend that we've had in a while, and the biggest tournament weekend for the new meta that we've had. And I'm going to be going over some hot decks as well as which tournament I'm talking about. So let's dive in. If you head on over to Limitless, you will go ahead and be able to see the upcoming tournaments, or depending on when you're watching this, the tournaments may have already been started or may already be concluded. But let's start off with the first of three tournaments that I'm going to highlight this weekend. We've got the Pocket Legends League. It's specifically going to be catered to the Asian countries, so that way they have a pretty big tournament for their time zone, ran by one of these organizers. Now, obviously, if you've been following the metagame at all, you know that there's a lot of Japanese tournaments going on independently. There's even like a Japanese ranked competition that they've got going on. So a lot of different things going on across different Asian countries as well. But this is going to be a big tournament. I think there's already somewhere around 400 people registered. So we'll see how large this tournament gets. And looking at the last week's winner, it was a Arceus Dialga deck followed by Dark Zone in the finals. So who knows what we'll see there this week. But again, should be a pretty fun tournament to follow. Then you've got the classic Ursiiday Pocket Weekly. Been going on for a while now. The largest ongoing tournament that we've seen every week for a long time now. And yeah, also a big shout out to Ursi for putting this event on, as well as her sponsor. Definitely worth giving them a shout out as well. But again, this tournament is going to be on Saturday, so March the 8th, depending on where you are, because I know I don't want to go over time zones, because right now the video has like my time zone, so your time zone is going to be way different, right? In a lot of cases. So anyways, but again, we've got the Ursiiday Pocket Weekly going on this weekend. And again, last weekend was the big surprise, right, where we saw double Sudowoodo mirror matches, right? We saw the in the finals, two decks bringing Sudowoodo along with the Rampardos line, and Lucario was in the finals, and it notched out two Arceus Dialga decks in the top four. So again, really cool to see how the meta looked. But again, you look at this top cut, there was a lot of Arceus Dialga. It was dominated by Arceus Dialga, so you gotta assume that the meta probably for the past week has been shifting around the results of these large tournaments, and definitely Ursiiday's tournament, right? Seeing Rampardos and Sudowoodo do so well on a big stage definitely has made that deck a lot more popular, specifically if you've been playing the 5-win streak event, right? So I want to stop for a second and get you in the mindset of thinking about ranked. If you already can kind of sense that there's a little bit of a connection between the Ursiiday Pocket result and then the decks that you see on these 5-win streak events, that's probably similar to what you're going to see when ranked finally goes live. So that's something that's really important to start thinking about for those of you that really want to grind the game at the highest level possible for themselves. Definitely know that it's probably good to keep an eye on these tournaments, right? Because a lot of the time, these winning decks are probably going to be very popular on the ranked or in these 5-win streak events, right? So definitely something to keep in mind. We also have the Hooglandia and Spragels Open with another weekend tournament that has happened once previously, but not in this current meta. So there's no previous direct info that I can give you, but I do know that the last time and the only time that this tournament has happened before was with Bastiodon Skarmory making a pretty big appearance. So who knows what this meta will look like. But again, if you look at previous tournaments and kind of try to look at how they change weekend to weekend, the meta usually does start to look similar as we get further and further into the meta, right? So 2 weeks, 3 weeks into the meta, we kind of have pretty similar, if one tournament has Arceus Dialga played at 17%, then odds are the other tournament that has the same amount of people or around the same amount of people, it'll probably have roughly like around the same percentage, give or take a couple percent. So like usually the metas do look pretty similar, but in the early days, like the early tournaments, the early weeks, sometimes the meta can be, you know, noticeably different in some of these events, you know, just kind of giving you some info as to what to expect, you know what I mean? And again, like there's different ways to interpret that, right? Like, would you assume that because of that, we're going to see maybe two different metas? Because if you remember, the last time we had Hooglandia and Spragels hosting a tournament, and then we had Ursiiday hosting a tournament, Palkia actually did way better in one of the tournaments and was way more represented, even though they were going on at the same time. So yeah, I don't know, pretty interesting to think about. But anyway, so let's talk about some potential decks that I could see doing well this weekend and highlight some decks that have been successful this past week. Starting with a couple of Dialga decks. Let's talk about this Dialga deck that does feature a card that you may not have played any games with, but it's the Origin Form Dialga. And I gotta tell you, I played a little bit with it, and I was pretty impressed. I will tell you also that I've been impressed with the Palkia as well, the Origin Form. So we'll talk about that when we get to that deck. But anyways, so you've got double Dialga, you've got one Arceus, you've got one, you know, non-EX Dialga, and then you got Shaman and double Skarmory. So you're trying to get that early tempo and really, you know, be able to pressure your opponent if you're ramping, or to be able to immediately start pushing for damage with Skarmory while you load your Arceus EX or your Dialga EX, right? So you got a couple of different options. And then the other like ideal game for you is that you're basically going 1-1-2. So you're letting them knock out a Skarmory, maybe the non-EX Dialga, and then they finally have to take down one of your EXs. Like that's the, you know, the ultimate best case scenario, right? For a lot of people that are trying to pilot this deck. When you take a look at the trainers, you do have one Dawn to help you go ahead and get to that fourth energy, potentially on Dialga to nuke something for 100. It also could help with Arceus EX. You know, depending on where you're at in the game as well. You got one Giovanni to help try to fix some damage. You got double Rocky Helmet to also continue adding damage, and hopefully damage that your opponent can't heal before you can KO it. One X speed over a Leaf, which is kind of interesting, right? But like if I could critique, and then one Cyrus, one Sabrina. So if I would like give you different cards that you could play, you could maybe arguably cut the Skarmories and just go ahead and play double non-EX Dialga and still get pretty decent results, and maybe add a Arceus. You know, I don't know. The thing about Arceus is you do want, you know, a good amount of basic Pokemon. You don't really want to go to a low basic Pokemon count with Arceus EX in a lot of decks, right? Like 6, pretty borderline, right? 7, pretty decent. 8, pretty good, right? It's just kind of like the same logic you used to use with those Pikachu EX decks. The other suggestions that I would probably look at are maybe a Leaf in place of the X speed. I would potentially, again, just kind of maybe look at the Healing Shaman as well, and maybe just adding another Arceus. So there's a lot of different options that you could go. But again, this deck is, you know, it got top 16 in a tournament, and I wanted to showcase it because it's a little bit of an aggro take on, you know, the Arceus Dialga decks that we've been seeing. Another Arceus EX and Dialga EX deck is kind of some of the changes that I was hinting at, except they did this. The deck does look a lot different, honestly. So you got the double Arceus, the double Dialga, you got the Healing Shaman, and then you've got one Skarmory where you can kind of go aggro in the early game as well. And you'll notice there's only 3 Pokemon tools, so there might be some inconsistencies with you being able to actually deal 50 in that Skarmory compared to if you were playing, you know, the double Skarm and 4 Pokemon tool lineup that we see in a lot of these decks. But you know, you could make the argument that, hey, maybe cut the Skarmory, maybe add another Shaman, maybe cut the Skarmory and, you know, add another Rocky Helm to try to fix damage. There's a lot of things you could do there. And honestly, it just kind of comes down to player preference. But again, like I could see both of these Dialga decks popping up again, especially like the idea of trying to be a little bit more aggressive with the Skarmories. But, you know, that's just a couple of ways that you could play Arceus and Dialga this weekend. And, hey, good luck to those who choose to do so. This is the familiar deck list that a lot of people have played, maybe give or take a couple cards. when it comes to Rampardos, Lucario, and Sudowoodo. Some people would say, hey, can I squeeze in a Hitmonlee in there? Even though it doesn't work with Lucario, just because Hitmonlee is a good card. Yeah, that's definitely something that you could do. Then when you also take a look at the trainers and supporters, maybe you want to cut the Giant Cape. Maybe you want to add in another another Pokemon communication. That could be an option. Maybe you just want to go double Sabrina or double Cyrus as opposed to 1-1 split. There's all sorts of ways that you could play this. This deck just is going to be really good the more Arceus Dialga decks that you run into, right? And so this also is a really interesting thing to think about too in terms of deck building. But if Sudowoodo is going to be popular, maybe that also brings to mind maybe bringing some one prize attackers, so that way your one prize attackers can hopefully trade or at least take care of maybe a Rampardos or a Sudowoodo in a deck like this, right? So again, just kind of looking at both angles of potentially playing decks like this and playing against decks like this. But this deck will definitely not fall off. I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the most played decks in all of these tournaments. Probably going to be top 3 played rate, I would imagine, in all 3 of these tournaments. That's probably how much I would anticipate to see this deck. Maybe top 5, right, in all 3 of the tournaments. The next fighting deck that I will mention, I've been pretty high on since I made a video on it. This is a little bit of a different take, but it did take home first place in a 94-person tournament. So I do expect to see maybe a deck similar to this. Let's talk about some of these card choices as well as maybe some card changes that you could maybe try out as well. So it's got the double Hitmonlee, and again, you could easily split one Hitmonlee, one Sudowoodo, one Hitmonlee, 2 Marshadow, one Hitmonlee, 2 Sudowoodo, and just cut the Marshadow. There's all sorts of things you could do with that Pokemon lineup. I do sort of like the one Hitmonlee, one Marshadow, one Sudowoodo lineup just a little bit more, but that's just me. When I take a look at the trainers, I notice that there is double Cyrus to go ahead and have synergy with that double Hitmonlee, so that's going to help out when it does go off. There's also one Sabrina, so that's going to help you be really, really able to play flexible in the early game. There's going to be some games where your opponent's going to bench an extra Pokemon, or maybe they're just going to have a big retreater on their bench, and you're going to be able to Sabrina it out and maybe stall for a turn. And that's going to be pivotal in some games. So again, Sabrina is a very good card right now. Especially if you're playing Dialga decks, right, and use Sabrina early to slow them down a turn, and now you're gonna still be able to attack on curve. Maybe you took less damage because you used the Sabrina. So there's all sorts of things that are good with Sabrina right now. Definitely would not be cutting that card in probably any deck and playing at least a one of in pretty much every deck. But Cyrus just wins games, right? That's the other thing. Cyrus is just a game closer. The other cards in this deck that I wouldn't want to cut are the Pokemon communications. I do think that helps you see Gallade on time more often, which is a good thing because, again, it's one of those cards that can attack on curve going first or second as you evolve it, right? So then you've got the 1x speed there to help you transition out of those openers, and again, that's going to give you free retreat to any Pokemon in this deck because the retreat costs are so low, which is also another good reason to only play 1x speed. So I hope I've given you some different card suggestions, and I do think that this deck is very good, very, very good. I wouldn't be surprised to see it take home a top 4. I wouldn't be surprised to see it really surprise some people. Let's get to some different tech decks that I've seen throughout the week, and I'll kind of talk about them and kind of give my thoughts on them as well. So this is the Arceus Carnivine and then Rotom deck. So the Rotom is a sniper, right? And the Carnivine, best case, is doing 50 damage because you have Arceus on your bench and Carnivine in the active. You've got Dawn to help you move energies around and help you able to attack earlier. You've got the Shaman that lowers your retreat cost by 1. So you could potentially have free retreat on almost every Pokemon outside of Arceus. The double Giant Capes help your Pokemon live longer and maybe survive some breakpoints, so that way you can get an extra swing with them. The Giovanni is going to be a damage fixer, which is going to be huge because sometimes dealing the 20 damage and then the hopefully 130 plus 10 on the Giovanni is going to equal 160, and 160 is a big damage breakpoint. So you got the Pokemon communication, the 1 Rocky Helmet, and double Sabrina. So this deck, you know, it's fascinating because you just saw a Hitmonlee deck, right, that played double Hitmonlee, double Cyrus, but you see with this deck it's going double Sabrina as opposed to the double Cyrus, even though they're both playing, you know, a bench sniper, or two of them, right? So really interesting deck building choice. The thing that concerns me about this deck is whether or not it's able to hit hard enough for some of these EX Pokemon that are out there that are able to heal. And then also, like, there's some glassy Pokemon in this deck that, even though you're going to be able to line up a 1-1-2 prize game, like it's still like, you know, it probably isn't super difficult to knock out some of these basic Pokemon that are non-EXs in this deck. So I don't necessarily think that this deck is like you know, something that I would want to bring this weekend, but it's definitely a deck that, you know, may be out there. And in terms of card changes, I mean, like, I mean, maybe you could make the argument trying to squeeze in Cyrus over a Sabrina. Maybe you make the argument you squeeze in 2 Rocky Helmets instead of the 1-1 split. Maybe you just cut the Pokemon communication because, you know, best case it's finding you Arceus when you don't have it, I guess, is probably the best argument against that. So but again, like, I just don't think that this would be my pick for tournaments this weekend. I got to talk about it because, hey, it's done okay. I mean, top 4 in a 327 person. I was able to secure 5 wins with Probopass as well. So, hey, might as well throw it out there. Let's talk about this deck really quickly. It's playing Magnezone, it's playing Skarmory, and it's playing Probopass. So kind of an interesting deck. You could make the argument like, hey, why not just play Dialga? And that's like very valid, right? Like, you kind of wonder like, hey, why are you playing the extra 1-1 line that can throw off your Pokemon communication and like really may not have very much upside? Like, why not just play, you know, a lot of other different steel type cards? And that's very valid. So like, I'll give you that. The other things to look at in this deck are the fact that it does run double Skarmory with 3 Pokemon tools. It does play 1 Pokemon communication to try to fix those evolution lines. As far as like, and then it plays the 1-1 split Sabrina Cyrus, right? So the only things that I would look at here is like, you know, maybe either like going all in with the Skarmory and like 4 Pokemon tools, and maybe just like cutting the Nose Pass and Probopass, and then maybe fitting in, you know, I don't know, another card that helps with consistency, like maybe a Pokemon communication that could help. But again, like, I look at this deck and I just think that like there's I don't know, it's a weird deck to me, but Magnezone can fix a lot of things, and there's you know, a pretty good chance that you might be able to line up a 1-1-2 prize, right, game with this deck, right? Because like, yeah, they knock out a Magnezone, a Skarmory, and then they have to knock out Probopass. Like, I guess that could be like the absolute best case scenario. And, you know, I just don't really think that this deck is able to take advantage of the strength of Probopass very much. Like, the strength of Probopass, in my opinion, is that you're able to make it survive extra turn longer, best case 3 turns longer, right? Because you're able to continuously like heal and reduce damage. Like, that's the best case scenario. Your Probopass survives like 3 extra turns and your opponent like thought it could survive, right? But like, I just wonder if playing other cards is just not better for this deck the way that it like is constructed. So if you were going to run a pure Probopass kind of like centric deck, I think that this deck is probably better if you wanted to really focus on Probopass, because maybe it's the only new EX you have a pair of. Maybe you just want to have some fun. Maybe you want to play something a little bit different. But like, the idea that, you know, Probopass is like the worst card in the set, I mean, obviously false, right? Like, Giratina exists. But as far as like the worst EX, I mean, hey, you can make an argument. I don't know. But for this deck, you know, what you're doing basically is you're trying to find Dialga as early as possible as your opener, and then, you know, ramp up another Dialga or your Probopass, you know. And the thing is, Adaman is actually a card, the best way to think about it is it's like another giant cape. It's like another potion in some scenarios, right? That's the way to think about it. It's like it's a buffer of 28 HP. And the thing is, a lot of people don't realize this, it affects your benched steel types as well. So like, it makes a lot of cards like worse, okay? So Adaman is a really good card. It's just that you do have to figure out like when to use the card and when not to use the card, right? So you want to like make sure that your opponent is going to be dealing damage. And if your opponent is going to be dealing damage, then yeah, Adaman is a card that is going to be pretty effective in a lot of scenarios. The giant capes help your stuff live longer. The double potions also can take your Pokemon out of Cyrus potential range, and it can also, you know, act as like making your opponents or your Pokemon survive a longer turn, another turn. Cyrus and Sabrina 1-1 split, pretty normal, and then Leaf is there to help you transition and save energies and pivot a lot easier in different states of the game, right? It may be you opened up with Nose Pass, so now you got to retreat into your Dialga, and Leaf helps you do that without losing an energy, but it also helps you pivot Dialga that maybe you've already ramped with into your Probopass, so that way you can begin potentially getting an early knockout. It is worth noting, you've got 30 damage plus 90 damage, so that's potentially 120 over 2 turns, so that's something to think about in terms of math. It doesn't hit that 160 breakpoint. However, there could be times where you hit for 100 and then you hit for 90, so that's 190 over 2 turns, which is decent and can be pretty effective. Some of the matchups to think about too, when I played this deck, I was very surprised with how well it walled the fighting decks, right? Like if you can get an attack off with Probopass, and then if you can use Adamin, if you're using your capes and your potion, it can really screw up a lot of the fighting decks, like breakpoints, and obviously a lot of like the interactions between them knocking your stuff out. So yeah, very underrated against that. But again, like you're just gonna have times where, you know, you go first and you don't open Dialga and the deck just feels like I bricked, you know what I mean? So again, would not be surprised to see Probopass, you know, have a few spots you know, in the top, you know, 100, 124 of these tournaments, but I don't know about it winning an event at all. It's just another fun deck. Here's another Arceus EX deck, getting to the water decks that I wanted to show you guys. And the water decks are pretty fascinating, I gotta tell you, because I think that where we're at right now is we're realizing that Misty is one of the best cards in the game, like powerful, power-wise, right? Like it's one of the most powerful cards in the entire game. And really, for the first time in this game's existence, there's legitimate options to play where you can use Misty, but also your deck doesn't revolve around Misty. Like Misty just makes your deck better because it creates extra win scenarios. Whereas in the past, there's been times where Misty is like one of the sole main reasons why this deck is even any kind of successful. But now with the Manaphy's, obviously Palkias, and then you've even got some people playing Abomasnow, right? So we've got a lot of different cards that we'll talk about here in the water type, but let's talk about this Abomasnow. The best way to think about it is it's like another version of Starmie EX, okay? It's very similar in terms of, at the best case, it's a stage 1 that can hit, you know, attack for 2 energies. Now, obviously, Abomasnow is going to do 80 versus Starmie that deals 90, so that's a big drop off. And then Abomasnow has 3 retreats, so you're probably not like ever retreating it. It's probably in there till the end. You know what I mean? So that's something to keep in mind. But obviously there are scenarios where that's not the case, right? Because you could potentially have 2 energies and Leaf. You only lose 1 energy as it goes to the bench, and then it's 1 energy away from attacking as long as you have Arceus. So there are scenarios where it could work. The rest of the deck, and this person got top 16 with this deck, and I've played with it a little bit. I kind of like the other Palkia deck a lot better, but you know, this is just a deck where when it works, when you get Abomasnow on curve and you're able to attack with it on curve, it just feels really, really nice. Because unlike Starmie, like it's a 1-pointer, so even if they knock it out, you know, you can still power up a Manaphy, use it to ramp your Palkia on the bench, and use your Palkia as the finisher. So like there's a lot of good things about this deck. When you talk about the trainers, the double Arita is going to definitely be required in this deck in my opinion, and it's also going to help your Pokemon live longer, including any Pokemon that has a water energy attached. Like it's a global effect, okay? So like just to make sure that people know that, you know, as they're trying to, maybe they haven't played a game with this card, but any Pokemon that has water energy on your side of the field is healed, okay? So that's like, it could potentially heal you for, you know, 120 damage or higher, right? So just depends on the situation, but definitely a card that I would play as a 2 of. The Dawn does help you attack for 3 energy, a lot easier with things like Arceus EX, okay? So that's something that's a good combo card. And then there's also scenarios where it gets you to your last energy with Palkia, and then hey, there's scenarios where it helps you attack with Abomasnow. So different scenarios there. Then you've got the one Misty, which again, you can make the argument, hey, try to squeeze into, maybe cut a Cape. Sure, you could try to do that, but Cape does feel very nice in some matchups where your Palkia EX survives a hit from another Pokemon. Like your Palkia EX survives a opposing Palkia EX, right? Because it has Giant Cape and it only takes 150, so it has 20 HP left over. So there's a lot of different interactions, but again, personally, I'm not a huge fan of this deck, but when it works, it feels tremendous. It feels like you're on top of the world. I would expect a lot of people to potentially bring Gyarados EX. The biggest thing with Gyarados EX to me is that it can hit that 160 breakpoint in a couple of different ways. Maybe they're scared to attack your Gyarados because your Gyarados has Rocky Helmet, and it'll bring them into range of being one-shot by Gyarados. Then there's the other scenarios where, hey, you have Druddigon, they attack your Druddigon, so they take 20 damage, and all of a sudden, they're within range of being KO'd by Gyarados. Then there's the Kangaskhan to try to offset those opposing Manaphies. Like, that's the one thing that this deck, I think, is gonna probably struggle with, is like some of the other water decks where they open Manaphy and you open no way to deal with their Manaphy. So the Manaphy just snowballs out of control, right? It just ramps everything until like finally you're able to get up, a Gyarados, but by then they have like 3 different attackers ready to go, or 2 at least. So I think that's like probably one of the biggest weaknesses with this deck. But Arita being able to heal Druddigon is a weird tech play that some people may pull off sometimes to survive a little bit longer, but also remember it can heal Kangaskhan. Obviously it can heal Gyarados if they have water energy on them. The double Misty helps you create those high roll situations, but again, you look at the deck and you're like, man, I'm only playing 2 water types, right? So Misty is definitely going to be hit or miss in this deck. Maybe that's an argument for finding a way to play Palkia. Who knows? That's a whole different debate, right? Then you got the double Rocky Helmet, the double Pokeball, the double Research, and 1 Sabrina, 1 Leaf instead of 2 Leaf, or instead of the 1/1 Sabrina Cyrus split. So you need Leaf in this deck because there's going to be times where Druddigon needs to pivot out, and having it as a one-of, you're not gonna have it every time you need it, but hopefully you have it in the times where it's like game deciding. Could you squeeze in another Leaf? I think if you were going to squeeze in another Leaf, it would be very difficult. You would probably have to cut one of the tools, and you probably don't want to cut Rocky Helmet. And cutting Mystic or Giant Cape is going to feel kind of bad if you run into a lot of Hitmonlee, because there is a scenario where you put Giant Cape on your Magikarp and it survives. So that's going to be kind of awkward to cut, but that could definitely be the correct play. You'll notice that it does run Sabrina as opposed to Cyrus, and you can make the argument that's probably because it's not going to be able to chip a lot of damage. The only way it's chipping damage is obviously Druddigon or Kangaskhan or Rocky Helmet, or a combination, right? So chip damage may be hard to come by, and sometimes you might want to use that Sabrina early or use it to maybe play defensively. So hey, you've got Sabrina as opposed to the Cyrus. But again, I wouldn't be surprised to see Gyarados do at least make a run in one of these tournaments. But again, it's just a cool bulky Pokemon. I mean, 180 HP. There's not a lot of decks that can deal with that, and I think that that's also another big point about Gyarados. The last deck that I'll go over today is going to be the Palkia EX deck featuring Manaphy. And this was ran by a player who represents the Japanese flag named King Cooch. You can look up this tournament on Limitless, and you can check this out. It should be under completed. But this was the deck, and I played some games with a deck very similar to this. I'll give you some of my card choices. And I actually have been able to complete the win streak event 2 different times because, sometimes I play on like a free-to-play account as well as like my paid account, right? So on my free-to-play account, was able to go ahead and secure the win streak. And this is one of the decks that I used, but I used, instead of double Rocky Helmet, I played another Giant Cape and another Leaf. So I played this card except 2 different cards. So let's talk about this deck. So this deck wants to open Manaphy, obviously, or if it opens Palkias, it probably wants to open Palkia EX so it can at least start chipping damage. The ways that you get out of the active are usually Leaf, and so that's why I liked playing 2 Leafs, and that's going to help you pivot out of the Palkias a lot easier into the Manaphy. It does play that double Misty, so that way you can have the high roll potential. That plays the 1/1 split, Cyrus and Sabrina. And then this deck in particular played double Rocky Helmet and Giant Cape. So Rocky Helmet is going to help you fix damage, but personally what I found in this deck is that I would rather have Giant Cape. The deck also plays double Ursiiday to help any of your Pokemon potentially be healed if they have water energy. And this deck plays very well. I like this deck more than the Abomasnow deck because it doesn't rely on evolving. And because it doesn't play those extra Pokemon, you can fit in 2 more supporters or items. And like to me, like that is a massive difference. Like make no mistake, when you get Abomasnow on curve and Arceus is on your bench, you feel on top of the world. However, when you play this deck and you start using the origin form Palkia to start attacking and it flips heads, you feel great, right? Because it's going to deal 60 more damage if you flip heads, and if tails, it just does 60. So it's kind of like a very more an expensive version of Executor EX, but it does have a higher damage cap. So when I look at this deck, I really like the idea that you can go 1/1/2, and it's very easy to do. Either the Manaphy or the Palkia origin form, and then you kind of switch into whichever one wasn't that, right? Like if you open Manaphy, that's probably going to be the one that gets KO'd, and then you hopefully bring in origin form Palkia. If you open origin form Palkia, then hopefully after it gets knocked out, you're able to send in Manaphy to ramp up and finish off, ramping your other Palkias to move in. So again, like typically that's probably where you would want to open unless you just Misty high roll. And if you Misty high roll, then fantastic, right? Because there's going to be some decks where opening Palkia EX is going to be very strong and you're able to really put them on a clock. But there's also going to be some matchups where you run into like, Rocky Helmet Sudowoodo and you're just like, oh, this really sucks. So definitely a couple different things to think about there. And also when you take a look at the trainers, again, I played double Giant Cape and then 1 more Leaf, and I just didn't play Rocky Helmet, and that made me able to pivot out of the active spot a lot easier and not feel punished. The rest of the deck is pretty self-explanatory. I think it's a really strong deck, and again, the fact that you can go 1/1/2, give up a 1-prizer, another 1-prizer, and then make them KO your Palkia EX with all of your healing cards and maybe a potential Giant Cape, like that's going to be very tough for some decks to do, and that's the way that I would play this deck. But again, this person did very well in a tournament, so shout out to them, and that obviously means the deck can work probably both ways. But again, thank you guys for checking out these decks. In terms of like my final thoughts, honestly, it just feels like if you're playing evolutions, they better be really, really good because, like right now the format feels pretty fast in a lot of areas. And I feel like the longer that you drag the game out, it can be obviously a great advantage if you play big, bulky Pokemon. But like it's very hard to drag games out, I think, in this current format unless people brick or just playing very slow decks. And I think the format is pretty fast. So like stage 2 decks, it's very tough for me to say, hey, play Crobat or any of these stage 2 decks, because like unless it's like a Rampardos where it can just pop 1 energy and just start KOing EXs, it's a really tough decision to play a stage 2 Pokemon line. And although they just need to be really broken, be really bulky, or attack for a very large amount for a very efficient cost, right? Whether it's Charizard where you're attacking for the highest damage, or it's Rampardo for you're attacking for like a really cheap, right? So I think that like you really have to look at, why am I playing a stage 2? And like, could I just not play all basics or, stage 1 and basics? I think that's kind of a really big issue with the game right now. And honestly, like that's kind of why for the first time, I really don't think that I mind rare candy, but I know like that's still a hot topic, right? Like just make it a supporter. I and maybe some people wouldn't like it still. I don't know. Maybe maybe it would be too good. But again, like right now, I would say more than ever, the game feels pretty fast. And playing a stage 2, even though we have Pokemon research and so on, it can really feel like you're not playing the game. You're playing the game too fair, right? So I think you have to find ramp. You have to find like energy manipulation. You have to find something that breaks the rules of the game, or is just like really, really broken stat wise. I think, like, you know what I mean? Like in terms of 1 energy for 130, like that's insane, right? 1 energy for 40 or 80, like that's pretty good. You know what I mean? So you do have to have like a very good attack if you're going to be evolving. And obviously like stage 2s, the bar seems to be set even higher. Anyways, this video is really long, but again, I wanted to give you something really good to think about as you prepare for this tournament weekend. I wish you nothing but the best luck this weekend. And again, I can't thank you enough for letting me be background noise. Maybe it was entertaining, or hey, maybe you learned something. But until next time, I will catch you later. Peace.